Have you ever noticed how some people just seem to have things fall into place for them, while others face obstacles at every turn? It is not just about working hard. Some doors open easily for certain people, while others face barriers they don't even see. Many people assume it's because they're being discriminated against for some reason. But what if I told you that discrimination is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle? If we want to solve this problem, we need the right diagnostic. That means looking beyond just discrimination and understanding the deeper forces that hold some people back. In this video, I want to show you how two natural forces interact with each other to create unequal opportunities for different people. And crucially, this all happens even if no one intends to do any harm. And in fact, no one needs to be even aware of the harm they are causing. It emerges naturally from the decentralized process of many individual, subtle, and non-malicious decisions we all make, including myself. Okay, so let's talk about the two fundamental forces that combine to create unequal opportunities. The first force is something we all experience but rarely think about: segregation. I made a whole video about how segregation is a much bigger idea than most people think, which you might want to look at. Segregation happens every time people make different choices about where to live, who to spend time with, or which interests to pursue. Each choice brings us closer to some people and separates us from others. We separate ourselves through many choices beyond where we live: the school we attend, the job we take, the communities we engage with, the media we consume, the hobbies we choose, and the lifestyle we have. Many of these choices are often made without much thought, but they create invisible walls that bring us closer to some people and farther from others. These invisible walls don't function as absolute barriers, but they significantly increase the likelihood of meeting some people while reducing the chances of crossing paths with others. The more choices we make, the more invisible walls we build between ourselves and those who chose differently. But the thing is, we tend to underestimate just how many choices we make every day, and in turn, how these walls divide us. To make things worse, these walls don't just stack up. They often reinforce each other, compounding over time in ways we tend to underestimate. Think of a friend you used to be close to. At some point, they might have been the closest person in your life, but now, you barely talk. You may send a message here and there, but it's no longer the same, right? Well, a million little choices pull you in different directions, and neither of you have noticed it happen until it was too late. And that is with a person who was the closest to you at some point, so imagine how distant you are from most people you never met. So yes, you are far more segregated than you think. And crucially, this segregation is not necessarily caused by malice. It is simply human nature to focus on things that interest us, and as a result, different people end up exposed to different groups of people. But segregation alone would not necessarily be a problem if it weren't for something else, something built into how we relate to other people. I'm talking about empathy. Empathy is one of the fundamental traits that allow us to connect with people. It makes us care about people, help them, but here's the thing: our empathy is not evenly distributed. It is biased. And that's where the second force comes in. Segregation alone wouldn't be a problem if we didn't have biased empathy, our tendency to care more about people who are closer to us. Here's an example of biased empathy. I like my child more than yours, and you like your child more than mine. That is just how people are. We prioritize those closest to us. There is nothing malicious about this. It is just human nature. And this bias is not just about family. It influences how we interact with everyone. We all tend to favor people we know and like. And that's where things get dangerous, when biased empathy meets segregation. Think about it. Segregation creates different networks, and biased empathy means we are more likely to help people in our own network. But now ask, what happens if I have more power than you do? Then the people in my network get more advantage than people in your network. And now that my friends have more advantages, they will have more power than your friends. And who do they tend to help? Me and my friends. And now we get even more powerful. So over time, my network keeps getting more opportunities and becoming even more powerful. That is really how inequality grows, not just through exclusion, but through everyday acts of generosity that are unevenly distributed across segregated networks. Take job referrals, for example. A hiring manager may not have any explicit bias, but if they receive a recommendation from someone they trust, they're more likely to prioritize that candidate. And who do they trust? People they already have some kind of connection with. Now think about mentorship programs. A senior executive might take an interest in mentoring a junior employee. How did that interest begin in the first place? It is often sparked by seeing something familiar about that person. Maybe they went to the same school, grew up in the same kind of neighborhood, or shared a similar cultural background. That junior employee now gets unique access to insights, advice, and network opportunities that someone outside that familiar circle won't receive. Or consider startups. Venture capitalists often invest based on personal recommendations and gut feelings about the founder's potential. But from their perspective, they are not choosing between two equally good options. They are taking a risk on someone they genuinely believe in. And who do they believe in? Often, it's people who feel familiar, who remind them of themselves in some way, whether through shared education experiences, cultural background, or social circles. The same dynamic plays out in Hollywood. Many of the biggest movie directors and actors got their start because someone already inside the industry took a chance on them. But from the insider's perspective, it doesn't feel like they are shutting anyone out. It feels like they are just helping a person. The insider is not thinking, I'm excluding someone. They're thinking, I see the potential in this person and I want to help them succeed. So you see, it comes from a good place, but it is still consequential. By helping one person, they are giving them an advantage over others. Scale this up across networks and decisions, and you get a cycle where power stays in the same circles, not because of conscious exclusion, but because helping one person inevitably gives them a leg up over everyone else. When you start thinking about this, you realize that this uneven kind of generosity is everywhere. For instance, we think of donations as acts of kindness, and they are, but they are also acts of bias. We give to the people and places we feel connected to. We support schools, hospitals, and organizations that feel close to us. We might get a GoFundMe link and feel compelled to help, because it's a friend of a friend or someone from our hometown. It all makes sense emotionally, but it also means people outside our bubble are less likely to receive our help, even when their need might be greater. And this problem shows up in government too. Imagine a senator drafting a bill with the help of a team of advisors. These advisors are not drawn from a representative sample society. Most of them likely have college degrees, often from top universities, so their perspectives are shaped by elite education rather than the typical experiences of the broader population. Beyond that, they all have experience working in Washington, D.C., which means they are naturally attuned to the issues that dominate discussions in the Capitol. But Washington is not the whole country. The concerns that surface in a political hub like DC are often very different from those affecting people in a small town, in a rural community, or even a struggling city. Now, in the first draft, the bill will inevitably step on some toes. It will restrict certain rights, create unintended burdens, or simply overlook the realities of some groups. That is not unusual. Legislation is rarely perfect on a first pass. As the advisors review the bill, each of them notices different issues, but not randomly. They are drawn to the problems that affect the people they know, the communities they relate to, the struggles they personally understand. One advisor sees how a clause might make it harder for homeowners like their parents to get a mortgage. Another notices a regulation that could make life more difficult for working professionals, maybe professionals like their college friends. Others focus on problems that frequently arise in Washington, D.C., perhaps the regulatory burdens faced by industry with strong lobbying presence, or challenges that come up in city politics. This is not corruption or bad faith. It is human nature. We instinctively empathize with struggles we recognize, with the kinds of people we know well, and so, acting with good intentions, these advisors suggest revisions. They refine the bill, remove obvious pitfalls, smooth out rough edges, and in a way they succeed. The bill becomes more polished, more defensible, more aligned with the concerns that were voiced in the room. But not everyone's concerns were voiced. Some groups were never part of these discussions. No one instinctively thought about how the bill might affect low-income renters in rural areas, or gig workers, or people in industries outside their social circles. Their struggles were not maliciously ignored. They simply never came up. And so, despite everyone's best intentions, the final version of the bill still steps on the toes of those left out. Without deliberate malice, It reinforces inequality, favoring those already close to power while leaving others in the shadows. Even if there were no lobbyists in the room, and even if no one had conscious intents to favor a particular group, some people, particularly those with weaker political influence or less direct representation, would still be overlooked. Not because anyone wanted to exclude them, but because no one was close enough to them to see their struggles in the first place. I hope by now you are starting to see just how insidious bias empathy can be. But why do we all have this bias in the first place? For most of human history, we lived in small hunter-gatherer bands where it made sense to favor those in our immediate group. That's probably why this instinct is so deeply ingrained in us. After all, agriculture began only about 12,000 years ago, which is incredibly recent in evolutionary terms. Before then, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small groups, typically ranging from 25 to 50 people and rarely more than 100 people. These were people we relied on for survival, for protection, for food. Naturally, our brains evolved to prioritize them over outsiders because trusting and helping our immediate group meant life or death. Then civilization scaled up. We started forming large societies, cities, and complex economies. But our brains didn't have time to catch up. We went from intimate tribes to massive social systems almost overnight in evolutionary terms. Yet, we're still wired to feel stronger connections to those we see as part of our in-group, whether it's family, close friends, or people who share some kind of similarity with us. This is not a moral failing, it's just how we evolved. The problem is, with an equal distribution of power, this instinct creates systemic blind spots. Those in power naturally favor those in their own networks, even without realizing it. What do I mean about power here? It is not just about wealth or political influence. It is about the ability to influence decisions that affect others. The more decision-making autonomy someone has, the more they can shape outcomes in ways that benefit those within their network. So, we have segregation keeping people in separate social networks, and bias empathy making people closer to powerful networks more powerful. Because of these two forces, even a small initial advantage due to luck can already be enough to spark a self-reinforcing feedback loop that leads to extreme concentrations of power over time. This notion of feedback loop is crucial here, because these inequalities don't just add up, they multiply. Each small advantage compounds over time, not just for individuals but for entire networks, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. The junior employee who gets a mentor in my previous example does not just receive career advice, they gain insider knowledge, influential networks, and key opportunities that others never even hear about. With this head start, they are more likely to get promoted, and once they do, they become mentors themselves, helping people with backgrounds similar to their own, continuing the cycle. In my other example, the startup founder who secures funding doesn't just get capital, they also gain credibility, making it easier to attract more investors, hire top talent, and land major partnerships. As their company grows, they're more likely to mentor and invest in new founders who remind them of themselves, reinforcing the same patterns. And this same dynamic plays out in government too. The advisors who shape legislation in my previous example don't just influence one bill. They gain experience, connections, and political capital, which help them rise to even more powerful positions. Over time, the people who succeed in these roles, those who understand the political language, who know how to navigate elite networks, become the next generation of senior policymakers, think tank leaders, and political influencers. And who do they bring into the circles? People they relate to, those who share their background, their education, and their ways of thinking. As a result, the same narrow perspectives that shape today's policies will continue shaping tomorrow's, making it even harder for outsiders to have a voice in policy decisions. So, because these advantages build on each other, the gaps between those inside and outside these privileged circles don't just persist, they grow, often faster than we expect. And when we look at this enormous inequality we see today, we might have such a hard time believing that this simple combination of segregation and bias empathy could explain the whole thing. But my claim is that this happens because we underestimate how often we segregate and how impactful that is. I go into that more deeply in my segregation video, but essentially we tend to underestimate the number of choices we make each day, which is already a big reason to believe we underestimate the scope for segregation. But if that was not enough, the walls created by segregation stack up, so the amount of separation grows faster with the number of choices than we tend to think. And finally, the feedback loop brought up by segregation and bias empathy make the disparity in advantage to compound, and our brains are terrible at understanding something like exponential growth. It is like the classic example of a penny doubling every day. Imagine you have just one penny, and every day it doubles. After 5 days, you have only 32 cents, barely enough to notice. After 10 days, it is still just over $10. But by day 20, it suddenly jumps to over $10,000. And by day 30, that single penny has exploded into more than $10 million. That is the deceptive power of compounding. Early on, the changes seem too small to matter, but as they build on each other, the effects accelerate and the gap eventually becomes enormous. Segregation and bias empathy work the same way. A slight preference for familiar people, a small opportunity given to someone with the right circles, these differences start off feeling minor, but as they accumulate and reinforce each other, they lead to massive inequalities, not because of some deliberate conspiracy, but because we fail to grasp how small, repeated advantages can shape the final outcome in ways we never anticipated. So, how can we solve this issue? How can we break this cycle and ensure that people have access to more similar opportunities? Because inequality of opportunities is generated by these two forces, segregation and bias empathy, the first thing that comes to mind is to reduce the intensity of these two forces, right? If you're all interested, I'm happy to go deeper into this in another video. But for now, let me just say that trying to reduce the intensity of these two forces might have a lot of unintended consequences. So as of now, I'm very skeptical that this is a good approach. I know that at a more superficial level, it sounds nice to minimize these two forces that generate so many issues, but the practical approaches to do that I have seen so far seem to generate other distortions, so that might backfire. So, here's what I think is more promising instead. In my opinion, we must abandon top-down solutions altogether. We should not filter resources through institutions that, by their very nature, reflect the biases of those in power. Instead, we should move on to bottom-up approaches that empower individuals directly. I'm thinking of reallocating the enormous amount of resources that are currently being used for top-down approaches towards giving people cash transfers directly to provide them with the autonomy to make their own choices. Now, some of you may object to this idea because you may think that many of these people will not use these resources well, and you are probably right, but it's not like top-down policies are perfect either. I think it is useful here to step back and discuss a very dangerous manifestation of bias empathy that is at the heart of this objection. I'm talking about paternalism. Paternalism is the belief that certain groups, particularly marginalized ones like the poor, are unable to make the best decisions for themselves and that other people should make decisions on their behalf for their own good. This mindset justifies top-down policies that keep decision-making power with the elite rather than empowering individuals directly. Just in the United States, there are plenty of examples of paternalistic top-down policies happening right now, and each of them have their own issues. Look, for instance, at welfare programs with strict conditions. They assume that recipients need oversight rather than autonomy. Governments impose work requirements, drug tests, or spending restrictions on benefits as if poor individuals cannot be trusted to manage their own resources. But what actually happens? A lot of people lose benefits over bureaucratic technicalities rather than real violations, making it even harder to escape poverty instead of actually helping them get ahead. Or think about financial assistance programs that provide food aid but dictate what people can and cannot buy. Basic groceries? Fine. Hot prepared meals? Not allowed. The assumption here is that low-income families should always be more restricted on money than on time to cook. But this changes from family to family, and likely even within families depending on the day. What if the family one night is more pressed on time and cannot cook from scratch? And what if there is an issue in their kitchen and they cannot cook that day? As a third example, consider housing assistance programs. These programs often come with strict eligibility rules that force people to stay below a certain income threshold to keep their aid. So what happens if someone earns just a little more? They risk losing everything. Housing support, other benefits, sometimes ending up worse than before. And this is not just a theoretical problem. There are people who turn down promotions or extra work hours because earning slightly more would mean losing their housing assistance entirely. Imagine being in a situation where working harder and moving up in your job does not feel like a step forward, but a financial risk you cannot afford to take. Many of these programs also end up limiting mobility in practice, discouraging people from moving to areas with better job opportunities. If someone lives in a struggling city with high unemployment, they might not take a chance on relocating somewhere better because doing that could mean losing their housing assistance. Instead of encouraging upward mobility, these policies create a trap where taking even a small step forward might feel too risky. And the stress of navigating these bureaucratic systems is enormous. Families are forced to constantly prove their eligibility, spending hours gathering paperwork, attending mandatory meetings, and worrying about whether they are following every rule correctly. A single mistake, missing a deadline, filling out a form incorrectly, even taking on a small temporary job, can result in losing everything. Instead of focusing their energy on improving their situation, many people in these programs are stuck in a constant state of anxiety, trying to avoid penalties that could push them deeper into poverty. If that feels hard to imagine, think about the frustration of navigating your company's reimbursement process. Now multiply that stress by 10 and imagine your rent depends on it. So, top-down approaches all come with their own set of problems, and that is an understatement. The truth is, both bottom-up and top-down approaches will have inefficiencies. My guess is that bottom-up approaches already start less inefficient than top-down approaches. But this is just my educated guess based on logic and everything I know about the evidence in the literature. It is really hard to make a clear comparison here because the causal evidence on this literature is scarce, especially the causal evidence on unconditional cash transfers and especially in developed countries like the US. In any case, there may be some uncertainty for what happens at the start, but when we think about this over time, to me it becomes obvious that bottom-up approaches must be better. The key idea here is that we need to consider how mistakes get corrected over time. Even if both approaches start out equally inefficient, bottom-up approaches become less inefficient over time because they allow for faster error correction. Think about it. In top-down approaches, mistakes are harder to correct over time. It is not clear that the people most affected by these policies are able to voice their concerns to those who can correct these mistakes. And it is not even clear that these people have the incentives to correct them, because correction might imply they will lose their jobs, or might require them to admit past mistakes, or demand effort on their part without a clear reward for doing so. Because when top-down policies fail, the people enforcing them rarely feel the consequences, so the same bureaucrats and policymakers stay in place while the people affected have little power to demand change. In bottom-up approaches, of course, each individual has all the incentives to correct their own mistakes, because when you are in charge of your own life, there's no bureaucrat to blame, no paperwork to navigate, just you facing the consequences of your own decisions. That is the deal with autonomy, right? You get the freedom, but you also get the responsibility. Sure, many people might start making bad mistakes with this autonomy. Isn't that exactly what most of us did when we were first given autonomy, say by our parents? But over time, we learn from some of those mistakes and adapt it. My guess is that the same will happen here. Some people will learn and improve, while others will keep making the same mistakes. But there are reasons to believe that even those who will keep making the same mistakes might get more support over time. And this to me is another big reason for why the error correction system of bottom-up approaches should be faster. If we are poor, then chances are we are living paycheck to paycheck. We are barely able to support ourselves, let alone others. This constant strain makes it harder for us to be generous, to help friends and family in need, or even to pay attention to the struggles of those around us. But when we get more money, some of us might start looking out for each other more. The reduction in stress alone allows for a shift in attention, from pure survival to more mutual support. And this is where biased empathy actually works in our favor. Normally, biased empathy leads us to care more about the struggles of those closest to us while overlooking the suffering of those outside our immediate circle. And this is still happening here, but now we have a less powerful network becoming more powerful. If I am poor, not only I get the cash, many from my own network are also poor, so they also get the cash. So now each individual inside my network has less stress and financial pressure, which widens the range of who they are willing to help. Those who were once just barely surviving now have the bandwidth to care, to notice, to step in when someone in their community makes a bad decision or falls on hard times. A person who might have ignored someone else's struggles before simply because they were too overwhelmed with their own now has the capacity to care. So now, let's say I make some mistake with my own cash, say I start drinking a lot. Now there is more chance that people from my own network are more inclined to help me. And this makes bottom-up approaches even more effective over time. Because when people in a community are able to help each other, mistakes get corrected faster, not through slow-moving bureaucratic processes, but through direct, immediate support. Instead of waiting for an institution to decide whether someone needs help, the people closest to them, who understand their situation best, can step in. In a bottom-up system, their family, friends, and community members have a direct incentive to intervene on whoever is making a mistake. They are the ones who see the problem firsthand, who can apply pressure, offer guidance, or provide support in a way that is actually responsive to that person's situation. Because their well-being is directly connected to the well-being of those around them, they are naturally motivated to help correct mistakes. So crucially, this kind of correction happens at the level of the individual, without unnecessary interference in the lives of others. The people who spend their money wisely are left by themselves, free to make their own choices. Now let's think about how that would work in a top-down system. If I make a mistake, then the response is more one-size-fits-all, right? A rule gets imposed, maybe more restrictions on what people can buy, maybe harsher eligibility requirements. But these restrictions might not just apply to the person who made a mistake. Now, a mother using her cash assistance to pay rent or buy groceries is suddenly subject to the same constraint as someone who mismanaged their funds, or perhaps she now needs to gather more documents to prove she's not behaving like that other person. A blanket rule meant to prevent one bad outcome ends up creating a different kind of harm. And it is not only about making sure people who didn't mess up don't get punished for those who messed up. Part of the problem is that these top-down systems are not tolerant with mistakes, so people have fewer chances to self-correct. And the whole idea of learning is that it must happen in low-stakes environments. We often try something that does not work and then adapt. But here, there's no lenience. One mistake and the stakes might get high really fast. So, to sum up, my claim is that the advantage of bottom-up approaches is not just that they might already start out as less inefficient, it's that they get better faster. Of course, even after hearing all this, you might still be thinking, but maybe some oversight is necessary to prevent waste or bad decisions. Maybe a hybrid approach? Give them cash but with some strings attached? But ask yourself, who is doing this oversight? Who decides what strings get attached? And how much does it cost society to pay for these people to enforce all these conditions? Would you hire someone to act as a gatekeeper for your own money just to stop you from making bad decisions? Of course not. No one trusts there will be a person out there capable of being fully altruistic and have no biased empathy. So, if we would never hire such a person, why are we forcing poor people to pay for that service? Because make no mistake, they are paying for this service. Every dollar spent on bureaucrats to monitor and regulate them is a dollar that could have gone directly into their hands. And at the end of the day, isn't this just paternalism all over again? If you wouldn't want someone overseeing your own money, but you still think others need that oversight and they need to pay for it, then you are using your own position of power to impose your judgment on others. That is biased empathy in action. That is paternalism. Again, biased empathy is so insidious that it creeps into our own thinking before we even realize it. Ultimately, before we can design better policies, we need to change the way we think about power and how networks of opportunity are created. If we acknowledge that inequality of opportunity is a self-reinforcing cycle driven by natural human tendencies, we can begin to create interventions that are not just well-intentioned but truly effective. If we want to create real equality of opportunity, we must design a system that does not amplify the consequences of our blind spots, but rather mitigate them. But before we can do that, we have to stop pointing fingers and acknowledge that we all have these blind spots. The key difference between those who benefit from the system and those who are held back is not that some discriminate and others do not. I tend to favor my child over yours, and you tend to favor your child over mine. I tend to favor people I know and trust. You tend to favor people you know and trust. If you think about it, all these are forms of discrimination. The key difference is that some people have more power than others, and that is why some forms of discrimination are more consequential than other forms of discrimination. So, at the end of the day, it is all about power. We need to design systems that distribute power more evenly. And for me, paternalistic top-down approaches do the opposite. They keep decision-making in the hands of those who already have power. At this point, you might be wondering, if bottom-up approaches are so clearly better, then why are we still doing top-down approaches? It is easy to think the answer must be bad intentions, that powerful people just want to hold on to their power, and that might be true to some extent. But unfortunately, there is a deeper problem. In the marketplace of ideas, the ideas that tend to spread are often the ones that align with powerful networks, like the idea that we should solve problems through top-down approaches. And this could happen even if no one meant any harm. In fact, even if powerful people truly wanted to help the poor. It is just another explosive combination of segregation and biased empathy. And that's what I'll talk about in the next video.